The Nexus Station's grand emporium of sentient commerce operated with all the moral flexibility of a pretzel factory and twice the efficiency. Located in the heart of the galaxy's most prestigious trade hub, the establishment had earned its reputation through centuries of what civilized beings euphemistically called labor redistribution. The fact that this labor happened to be screaming, weeping, and occasionally attempting escape was merely an administrative detail, filed under inventory management, behavioral anomalies. The auction hall itself was a marvel of architectural indifference. Crystalline walls rose in perfect geometric precision, their surfaces reflecting the multicolored bioluminescence of the gathered crowd, while somehow managing to absorb every desperate sob that echoed within. The designers had clearly prioritized acoustics over empathy, a decision that spoke volumes about galactic priorities. Floating platforms hovered at various heights, each occupied by potential buyers whose species ranged from the elegantly tentacled to the aggressively chitinous. The air recyclers worked overtime, filtering out the complex bouquet of alien perspiration, anxiety pheromones, and what the maintenance crew had learned to classify as existential dread, concentrated. In this particular corner of civilized space, slavery wasn't merely tolerated, it was regulated, taxed, and came with a comprehensive warranty. The Galactic Commerce Authority had spent considerable effort establishing standardized pricing matrices for different species, with adjustments for age, skill level, and psychological resistance to bondage. There were forms to fill out, licenses to obtain, and health certificates to verify. The whole system operated with the kind of bureaucratic precision that made genocide look spontaneous. The current merchandise on display represented a cross-section of galactic misfortune. Tall, ethereal beings from the Centauri system stood with their characteristic dignity intact, even as energy shackles hummed around their wrists. Their stoic acceptance of fate was almost admirable, if one ignored the fact that their homeworld had been strip-mined into extinction by the very corporations now selling their children. Nearby, a cluster of insectoid creatures clicked and chittered in their native language, their compound eyes reflecting 1,000 fragments of the same hopeless reality. But it was the small crystalline being in the center of the platform that drew the most attention. The Catherian child couldn't have been more than equivalent to a human 10-year-old. Though determining exact ages across species was another bureaucratic nightmare the authorities had long since abandoned. Her body was composed of what appeared to be living gemstone, faceted surfaces catching and refracting the chamber's light into rainbow patterns that might have been beautiful under different circumstances. Currently, those same surfaces were clouded with stress fractures, and a continuous stream of what passed for tears in her species created small pools of liquid crystal at her feet. The child's sobs resonated through the hall with a frequency that made several alien species uncomfortable. Not uncomfortable enough to leave, naturally, but sufficiently so that they adjusted their auditory dampeners and continued calculating profit margin. Her species was known for their empathic abilities, which made them excellent servants for those who enjoyed the psychological feedback of their slaves' misery. It was a niche market, but a profitable one. The auctioneer, a being whose species had evolved past the inconvenience of facial expressions, began the proceedings with professional enthusiasm. Lot 47, juvenile Catherian female, estimated lifespan 3 centuries, full empathic capabilities, minimal behavioral conditioning required. The translator units converted this into dozens of languages, each maintaining the same tone of casual indifference that had made the Nexus Station famous throughout the galaxy. Bids began flowing in through various communication methods. The Thorgenian Consortium raised their offer through a series of color-coded pheromone releases. The Vex Collective transmitted their bid directly into the station's quantum network, their artificial intelligence calculating the child's worth down to the last decimal point. A representative from the Pleasure Worlds made a gesture with 3 of his appendages that apparently indicated a substantial increase in the current price, though to most observers it looked like he was either bidding or having a seizure. The child's crystalline form shuddered with each new bid, her empathic abilities forcing her to experience the buyer's intentions as clearly as her own terror. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present, that her suffering was simultaneously the product being sold and the sales pitch itself. The galaxy's most advanced civilizations had discovered that efficiency and cruelty weren't mutually exclusive. They were business partners. As the bidding reached its climax, with the child's price climbing to astronomical heights, few in the chamber noticed the figure observing from the shadows of the upper gallery. The being stood motionless, seemingly unremarkable among the diverse crowd of buyers and curious onlookers. But there was something about the way it held itself, the predatory stillness that suggested coiled violence, that would have sent warning signals through any prey animal's nervous system. The auctioneer's voice continued its professional cadence, counting down to the final sale, while the small crystalline being's sobs grew quieter, her hope fragmenting like light through a prism. And in the shadows above, something that had once been called human watched with eyes that held the collective fury of an entire species. The explosion that followed would later be described in 14 different languages as unprecedented, catastrophic, and really quite impressive from a technical standpoint. The reinforced barrier that had protected the auction chamber for over 2 centuries disintegrated with the kind of theatrical flair that suggested the human had either planned for maximum psychological impact or simply possessed an innate understanding of dramatic timing. The blast wave rolled through the chamber like an announcement of changed circumstances, carrying with it the distinctive smell of vaporized security systems and the sort of metallic tang that indicated someone had just introduced military-grade ordnance to a civilian environment. The carefully controlled atmosphere of commercial civility evaporated faster than the door's molecular structure, replaced by the kind of primal panic that reminded everyone present that beneath their sophisticated civilizations lay the same basic survival instincts that had kept their ancestors alive in considerably more dangerous times. Through the smoking breach stepped a figure that managed to look simultaneously unremarkable and absolutely terrifying. The human's appearance was almost aggressively ordinary, bipedal, carbon-based, and lacking any of the obvious predatory adaptations that characterized the galaxy's more notorious species. No scales, no fangs, no poisonous secretions or natural weaponry. Just a being that had somehow managed to reduce a military-grade security barrier to its component atoms using what appeared to be improvised explosives and an attitude problem. The auction chamber's occupants responded to this development with the kind of coordinated chaos that occurred when multiple species with different fight-or-flight responses attempted to evacuate the same space simultaneously. The Thurgonian consortium released panic pheromones that caused several nearby species to either flee in terror or attempt to mate with the nearest available partner. The Vex Collective's artificial intelligence components began broadcasting emergency protocols in 17 different languages, creating a cacophony of multilingual hysteria that would have been amusing under different circumstances. The human's entrance was followed by the kind of tactical assessment that professionals in the violence industry would have recognized as both efficient and thorough. The being's eyes swept the chamber with the methodical precision of someone cataloging threats, exits, and potential improvised weapons. The fact that this assessment took approximately 3 seconds suggested either exceptional training or the sort of pattern recognition that came from spending one's entire evolutionary history in environments where everything was trying to kill you. The security forces that had been positioned around the auction chamber represented the finest defensive capabilities that money could buy, assuming one's definition of finest included adequate for dealing with typical commercial disputes, and completely unprepared for Deathworlder incursion. The guards were armed with standard pacification equipment, designed to subdue unruly customers and the occasional disgruntled slave. Their training had covered scenarios ranging from credit disputes to territorial marking conflicts between incompatible species. None of their training had covered what to do when a human decided that the local business model required violent restructuring. The first security team to engage the human discovered that their energy weapons, while effective against most known species, had been designed with the assumption that the target would possess normal physiological responses to neural disruption. Humans, it turned out, possessed the remarkable ability to continue functioning while experiencing what should have been debilitating pain, a trait that their homeworld's generous selection of venomous, toxic, and generally hostile life forms had helped them develop over millions of years of evolutionary adversity. The human's response to being shot was both educational and brief. The improvised weapon that appeared in the being's hands had clearly been constructed from components readily available throughout the station, suggesting either remarkable ingenuity or the sort of practical knowledge that came from a lifetime of turning everyday objects into tools for violence. The results were as immediate as they were decisive, with the security team discovering that their protective gear had been designed to stop energy weapons, not kinetic projectiles traveling at velocities that violated several safety regulations. The auctioneer's attempts to maintain professional composure while his carefully organized sale descended into armed combat were admirable in their futility. The being continued his commentary even as buyers fled in panic and security forces engaged in what the emergency protocols euphemistically classified as aggressive customer service. The crystalline child remained on the platform, her empathic abilities forcing her to experience the emotional chaos of several hundred panicking beings, while simultaneously processing the approaching presence of something that radiated controlled fury. The human's advance through the chamber was less a charge, and more a systematic dismantling of everything that stood between the being and the auction platform. Each obstacle was addressed with the kind of practical efficiency that suggested extensive experience with problem-solving under adverse conditions. Energy barriers were bypassed, defensive positions were flanked, and the various alien species that constituted the station's security force discovered that their diverse biological advantages were less effective against an opponent who had spent its entire evolutionary history learning to kill things that were bigger, stronger, and better armed. The liberation of the merchandise began with the kind of methodical precision that indicated either military training or the sort of organizational skills that came from dealing with complex logistical problems under pressure. The humans' movements were economical, each action serving multiple purposes as restraints were disabled and the various sentient beings held for sale were freed from their confinement. The energy shackles that had held the crystalline child dissolved under the touch of some device that the human produced from what appeared to be an endless supply of improvised solutions. The child's reaction to freedom was immediate and overwhelming. Her empathic abilities, which had been broadcasting terror and despair throughout the chamber, suddenly shifted to something approaching hope. The crystalline formations that comprised her body began to clear, the stress fractures healing as her emotional state stabilized. For the first time since her capture, she looked up at her liberator with something other than resignation. The human's response to this moment of connection was barely perceptible, a slight softening around the eyes that might have been mistaken for fatigue by anyone unfamiliar with the species' emotional expressions. But the crystalline child's empathic abilities detected something that Chamber's sophisticated sensors had missed. Beneath the controlled violence and tactical efficiency lay a core of protective instinct that had driven this being across interstellar distances to challenge an entire civilization's accepted practice. The station's final defensive measure was the deployment of its automated combat systems, a network of weapon platforms designed to deal with threats that exceeded the capabilities of organic security forces. These systems had been programmed with threat assessment algorithms that could identify and respond to virtually any known form of hostile action. The computers analyzed the human's movements, calculated response patterns, and prepared to deploy force sufficient to neutralize what their programming classified as a moderate biological threat. The machines discovered that their creators had made a fundamental error in their assumptions about human capability. The being they were attempting to contain had spent its entire species' history learning to fight enemies that possessed every possible advantage except one: the willingness to continue fighting long after rational calculations suggested surrender. The automated systems were designed to deal with rational opponents who would retreat when faced with overwhelming force. Humans, as the galaxy was slowly learning, were not always rational when it came to protecting others. The figure in the shadows possessed that particular quality that made seasoned predators of a dozen different species suddenly develop an urgent need to be elsewhere. It wasn't the appearance that triggered this response. Humans, after all, looked remarkably unremarkable by galactic standards. No fangs, no claws, no natural armor plating or acidic secretions. They were, by most objective measures, embarrassingly fragile creatures who had somehow managed to crawl out of one of the galaxy's most hostile environments and make it everyone else's problem. The galaxy had learned about Earth the hard way. First contact protocols had been followed with all the enthusiasm of a tax audit, right up until the moment when the primitive species had demonstrated their particular brand of problem solving. The Zephyrian Empire had attempted to establish a standard resource extraction operation on the third planet of an unremarkable yellow star. The operation had lasted exactly 72 hours before the humans had turned their own mining equipment into weapons and introduced the Zephyrians to concepts like guerrilla warfare and motivated population. What followed was the kind of educational experience that left lasting impressions across multiple star systems. Humans, it turned out, didn't just fight wars. They specialized in. They had spent their entire evolutionary history perfecting the art of killing things that were bigger, stronger, and better armed than themselves. They had turned warfare into both science and art, with subspecialties that ranged from the brutally efficient to the creatively psychological. The galactic community's response to this discovery had been typically bureaucratic. Humans were classified as Deathworlders, a designation that came with its own complex legal framework. Trade with human territories was restricted. Contact protocols were revised to include hazard pay for diplomatic staff, and an entire department of xenopsychologists was established to study what they euphemistically called human behavioral patterns. The figure watching the auction belonged to that rare subset of humanity that had ventured beyond their home system despite the galaxy's collective preference that they stay put. The reasons for such journeys varied. Some were exiles, others were explorers, and a few were simply individuals who had decided that the galaxy's moral flexibility needed adjustment. This particular human fell into the third category, though the distinction was largely academic from the perspective of anyone who found themselves on the receiving end of human attention. Station security had been notified of the human's presence approximately 47 minutes earlier, which was 46 minutes longer than their emergency protocols recommended. The delay had been caused by the typical bureaucratic confusion that arose when multiple species with different threat assessment criteria attempted to coordinate a response. The Nexus Station's command structure included representatives from 17 different civilizations, each with their own understanding of what constituted an appropriate response to a Deathworlder incursion. The security briefing that followed was a masterpiece of controlled panic. The human had arrived on a small, unremarkable vessel that had somehow passed through 3 separate checkpoint systems without triggering any alarms. This was less a testament to human technological superiority and more an indication of the galaxy's tendency to prioritize efficiency over security. The ship's registration claimed it was carrying agricultural supplies, which was technically accurate if one considered the human's intent to cultivate a sudden and violent disruption of the slave trade. Current location tracking placed the human in Sector 7, moving through the station's commercial district with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested intimate familiarity with the layout. This was concerning for several reasons, not least of which was the fact that Sector 7 contained the primary security checkpoint for the auction chambers. The human's route suggested either remarkable intelligence gathering or the kind of intuitive tactical awareness that made Deathworlders particularly dangerous in confined spaces. The station's defensive systems were designed to handle the typical varieties of criminal activity that plagued interstellar commerce: theft, fraud, and the occasional territorial dispute between rival trading guilds were well within the parameters of normal operation. A motivated human with what appeared to be specific objectives fell into an entirely different category of threat assessment, one that the station's designers had apparently considered too unlikely to merit serious consideration. Emergency protocols were activated with the kind of efficiency that suggested considerable practice, though the actual implementation revealed the fundamental flaw in the station's security philosophy. The defensive measures were designed to contain problems, not eliminate. Energy barriers sealed off critical sections, automated systems began routing non-essential personnel to safety zones, and the station's small security force prepared for what their training manuals classified as extreme biological hazard containment. The human's progress through the station was tracked by a network of sensors that painted a real-time picture of systematic infiltration. Each security checkpoint was bypassed with the kind of casual competence that suggested either extensive preparation or the sort of improvisational skills that came from a lifetime of turning everyday objects into weapons. The security feeds showed a figure moving with predatory grace through corridors designed to channel foot traffic into predictable patterns. As the human approached the auction chamber complex, the station's automated systems began implementing lockdown procedures with increasing desperation. Emergency bulkheads slammed shut, atmospheric controls shifted to emergency settings, and the entire facility prepared for what the computers optimistically classified as containment breach protocol. The irony that a space station dedicated to the systematic dehumanization of sentient beings was about to discover the true meaning of that term was lost on the artificial intelligences coordinating the response. In the auction chamber below, The bidding for the crystalline child continued with the kind of oblivious determination that characterized commerce throughout the galaxy. The buyers remained focused on their calculations. The auctioneer maintained his professional enthusiasm, and the merchandise continued to suffer in dignified silence. None of them had yet realized that their carefully ordered world was about to encounter a species that had built its entire civilization on the principle that some things were worth fighting for regardless of the odds. The human reached the final security checkpoint with the kind of timing that suggested either remarkable luck or professional competence. The reinforced doors of the auction chamber lay just beyond, their construction designed to withstand everything from natural disasters to terrorist attacks. They had been tested against plasma weapons, kinetic bombardment, and every known variety of explosive device in the galactic arsenal. They had never been tested against a human with a personal grievance. The Nexus Station's emergency lockdown protocols were implemented with the kind of bureaucratic thoroughness that had made galactic civilization famous for its ability to turn any crisis into a paperwork exercise. Blast doors sealed with hydraulic precision, atmospheric systems shifted to emergency configurations, and the station's central computer began broadcasting evacuation notices in 47 different languages, while simultaneously filing incident reports with the appropriate regulatory authorities. The lockdown was designed to contain threats within specific sectors, while maintaining operational capacity in non-affected areas. It was a sensible system that had been tested against everything from toxic gas leaks to territorial disputes between incompatible species. The protocols assumed that any threat could be isolated, analyzed and eventually neutralized through the application of sufficient resources and proper procedure. The system had not been designed to contain a human who had concluded that the entire station represented a moral hazard that required immediate remediation. The freed slaves moved through the corridors with the kind of coordinated efficiency that suggested their liberator possessed organizational skills that extended beyond the purely destructive. The crystalline child stayed close to the human, her empathic abilities providing real-time feedback on the emotional states of potential threats. The other former prisoners, a diverse collection of species that represented the galaxy's talent for turning misfortune into profit, followed with the determined stride of beings who had suddenly remembered what hope felt like. The humans' route through the station demonstrated either remarkable intelligence gathering, or the kind of intuitive tactical awareness that came from spending one's evolutionary history in environments where navigation errors were typically fatal. Each checkpoint was bypassed with casual competence. Security measures were disabled with improvised solution. The various alien species that constituted the station's population discovered that their carefully ordered world was being systematically deconstructed by someone who apparently viewed their civilization's fundamental assumptions as optional suggestions. The philosophical implications of this development were not lost on the station's command structure. The Nexus Station represented the pinnacle of galactic commercial achievement, a place where beings from hundreds of different worlds could come together to engage in mutually beneficial economic activity. The fact that this activity included the systematic commodification of sentient life was simply one of many services offered in the pursuit of prosperity. The galaxy's various civilizations had spent centuries developing the legal frameworks, ethical justifications and practical procedures that made such commerce possible. A single human had apparently decided that these carefully constructed systems were insufficiently robust to survive contact with someone who possessed fundamentally different assumptions about the nature of acceptable behavior. The station commander's attempts to negotiate with the human were hampered by the fact that their species had never developed effective communication protocols for dealing with beings who appeared to be immune to rational self-interest. The commander's offers of compensation, safe passage, and various forms of diplomatic immunity were met with the kind of silence that suggested either complete incomprehension or the sort of focused attention that preceded violent action. The human's response, when it finally came, was delivered in the flat, emotionless tone that professionals in the violence industry would have recognized as a very bad sign. The being's demands were simple, comprehensive, and completely unacceptable to anyone whose livelihood depended on the systematic exploitation of others. The immediate release of all sentient beings held in bondage, the dissolution of the station's slave trading operations, and the implementation of what the human euphemistically called corrective measures for those responsible for the current situation. The counter-offer that followed was both predictable and illuminating. The station's governing council, representing the commercial interests of 17 different civilizations, attempted to explain the legal, economic, and practical considerations that made such demands impossible to fulfill. Their presentation included charts, economic projections, and detailed explanations of the regulatory frameworks that governed interstellar commerce. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic reasoning that demonstrated the galaxy's talent for turning moral questions into administrative challenge. The humans' response to this educational presentation was brief, direct, and involved the kind of improvised explosive device that suggested either extensive military training or the sort of practical chemistry knowledge that came from growing up on a world where everything was trying to kill you. The council chamber's reinforced construction proved inadequate to contain the blast, though it did succeed in protecting the structural integrity of the surrounding sections. The philosophical reversal that followed was both inevitable and profound. The galaxy's most advanced civilizations had spent millennia developing sophisticated justifications for their treatment of less technologically developed species. The weak existed to serve the strong, the primitive were naturally subordinate to the civilized, and the systematic exploitation of others was simply the natural order of things. These beliefs had been codified into law, embedded in cultural traditions, and reinforced through centuries of successful practice. The human's presence forced a fundamental reconsideration of these assumptions. Here was a being from a world that the galaxy had classified as primitive, representing a species that had been dismissed as barbaric, single-handedly dismantling systems that had been built and maintained by the combined efforts of dozens of advanced civilizations. The implications were as uncomfortable as they were undeniable. The final confrontation took place in the station's central hub, where the human faced the last desperate attempts of the security forces to restore order. The battle was brief, decisive, and educational in ways that would influence galactic military doctrine for generations to come. The humans' tactical approach demonstrated a level of strategic thinking that suggested either formal training or the kind of intuitive understanding that came from a lifetime of solving problems through the application of controlled violence. The escape that followed was as systematic as everything else the human had accomplished. The freed slaves were evacuated through a series of service corridors that led to the station's docking bays, where a collection of appropriated vessels waited to carry them to safety. The humans' knowledge of the station's layout suggested either extensive preparation or the sort of adaptive intelligence that made the species particularly dangerous in unfamiliar environments. The aftermath of the incident rippled through galactic society with the kind of devastating efficiency that characterized information distribution in an interconnected civilization. The news that a single human had successfully challenged the slave trade sent shockwaves through commercial networks, diplomatic channels, and military planning committees. The implications for existing power structures were profound and deeply unsettling. The galaxy's response to this development was characteristically bureaucratic. Emergency sessions were called, threat assessments were updated, and new protocols were established for dealing with human incursion. The slave trade continued, but with enhanced security measures and carefully worded disclaimers about the risks involved in certain types of commerce. But in the depths of space, traveling toward destinations that the galaxy's tracking systems couldn't identify, a small group of former slaves continued their journey toward freedom. The crystalline child's empathic abilities no longer broadcast despair and terror. They carried something that the galaxy's sophisticated civilizations had almost forgotten existed. The possibility that strength and morality were not mutually exclusive, and that sometimes the most primitive beings possessed the most advanced understanding of what it meant to be truly civilized. The human, meanwhile, had already begun planning the next correction to the galaxy's moral assumptions. After all, there were many more stations, many more auctions, and many more opportunities to demonstrate that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the odds or the opposition. The galaxy had spent centuries teaching the universe that might made right. It was about to learn that sometimes the mightiest force in the universe was someone who simply refused to accept that lesson.